Ned Wingreen, grew up in Los Angeles and went to a local college, Caltech, where after some debate, internal debate, I decided to major in physics because it seemed like if I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, physics would be enabling for future choices, and that was a good decision. After Caltech, I decided to go to graduate school and to continue in physics. After, again, some internal debate, I decided to go to Cornell to study an area called condensed matter physics about materials, metals, semiconductors, superconductors, all sorts of places where dense aggregates of matter have interesting behavior. And one of the reasons I chose Cornell was that I thought that the graduate students were treated well there. They were treated as junior colleagues, as opposed to some other schools, which I won't name, back in the day where graduate school was more of a Darwinian experience where the weak were weeded out. And I felt that people at Cornell were treated more like they deserved to be there. And that was a great decision. I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot. And I went on after that to do a postdoc in the same general area of condensed matter physics, looking at quantum mechanical effects in small semiconductor structures. And I did that at MIT, enjoyed living in Boston for a couple of years. And I took a job, and somewhat unusual, instead of trying to get a faculty job, although I did interview for those, there was a new research lab that had just started in the area of Princeton University, but not associated with Princeton University, run by a big Japanese company called NEC. And they were going to start a very blue sky research lab that was going to work on problems with a 30-year timeline. And I thought, wow, this sounds amazing. And it was. It just didn't last 30 years. It lasted more like 12 years before the Japanese economy wasn't doing so well. It's unfortunate, but it was great for many of us who were there at the time. And so they were scaling back on their basic research. I had already at that time, while I was at NEC, started to make a move into problems in biology. So that was something completely new. I remember as an undergraduate being very skeptical of biology. I was doing physics, and physics was fundamental, and whereas biology was just, lots of small balls and sticks running around and, not really fundamental. I've completely changed my view. I think emergent behavior that happens when you put a lot of atoms together and they start crawling around is just as interesting as figuring out what's happening in a black hole or with quantum strings. So it started out as a hobby. Just a colleague of mine and I, and a postdoc we'd hired, were fooling around with some problems about proteins, these things that are enzymes and motors and do all sorts of functions inside of our cells. And that was supposed to just be, a side project, but it was a very slippery slope. Really started finding those problems interesting, and I have slid all the way into a molecular biology department. So 20 years ago, it's already been a while, I left NEC because everyone was going to be fired. And so it seemed like a good idea to leave before that happened. Was able to get a job as a professor at Princeton University, which was great because I didn't have to move. Actually, my commute got shorter. So I bike to work at Princeton, and I have been super happy with that transition. I love working at Princeton. I think it's a great place for you and your high school colleagues to consider in the future. Good. Get in touch with me when you apply. And one of the things I love about Princeton is it's a super collaborative, interactive environment. So I have always done theory and modeling. I don't have an experimental lab, and I have never felt the need to as a faculty member at Princeton because I have these fantastic colleagues who are superstar experimentalists. And they're very, very open and eager to collaborate, done projects and written papers with something like 20 different colleagues at this point. I consider that the best thing about my job is being able to work together with people. Of course, I work with my own students, postdocs, and so on, but also with my colleagues at Princeton, and that's been a wonderful experience. So it's a long introduction to who I am.
Recently, I interviewed someone at Stanford, and they mentioned that Princeton has a really good integrated science program. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so Princeton has had a very an interesting integrated science program for undergraduates coming in as freshmen who are saying, well, should I study biology or chemistry? But I like physics too. I also like computer science. And this was a way of integrating that into one double course for freshmen to take, where they would learn some aspects of all of these fields in the context of life science applications. That's currently being rebooted in a way, being modernized. And I expect it will continue to be offered at Princeton with slightly different content because these things keep changing. Princeton is a great place for those who are interested in these interface between sciences because many of the faculty are working at those interfaces, and so we very much believe that that's where education should be going.
Could you explain your research in more understandable terms?
Sure, I'll do my best. And I should say that one of the things that's been great for me about doing theory and modeling is to be able to work on a number of different projects in different areas because I don't need to buy a lot of expensive equipment or learn how to keep particular cells alive or have mice somewhere in the basement. And so my group works on a number of different areas. One area that's definitely been and will continue to be a major focus for my group is microbiology. That's studying single-cell organisms, tiny little bacteria, or single-celled eukaryotes like us, because they do all sorts of amazing things, even though they're small. We think of ourselves as being very advanced, but bacteria are quite good at doing many of the things we do. They move around, they find food, they grow and they reproduce, even though they're only 2 microns long. And so, particularly from a point of view of someone interested in the fundamental principles of how these functions are performed robustly by the interaction of a few proteins inside of the cell that are just diffusing around and bumping into each other. Bacteria are a great place to study it because in some ways they're more parsimonious. They use fewer moving parts to solve the same problems, but they've discovered the robust ways of doing it. So for example, we spent many years studying something called chemotaxis, which is how tiny bacteria figure out which direction to move in to find food. And it's interesting. It's based on the idea that they swim in a random direction and they ask, are things getting better? It's sort of like the way people vote. They just say, am I better off or worse off than I was 4 years ago? And then they vote accordingly. The bacteria behave the same way. They say, if I'm swimming and I'm better off, then I'm probably going in the right direction and I'll keep going. But if I'm worse off, I'm going to change direction into some random direction, and then try that again. So it's a wonderful system to epitomize how these organisms take in information, process it, make decisions, and then transduce that into some mechanical changes that actually let them change direction. We also work a lot on how bacteria talk to each other. It turns out that we are not the only organisms that communicate. They don't communicate with words, they communicate with chemicals. They make small molecules and those diffuse, and other bacteria sense the concentration of those. And as a result, they can end up making collective decisions. So even though we often in textbooks think of bacteria as being loners, that's really not the case. They're constantly talking to each other and deciding to do collective behaviors that wouldn't make sense to do individually. For example, in the case of pathogens, which is, things that cause disease, they can use this to decide when there are enough of them to attack a host like ourselves. Also, they can do more benign things like deciding when to form biofilms that are defensive structures with bacteria form where they can attach to a surface and hunker down. And we work there with a fantastic colleague who's the now chair of my department at Princeton, Bonnie Bassler, who has spent her career studying how bacteria talk to each other, a really fascinating area that I continue to work in. But I should say that, as I said, my group works on lots of different things. One area that we work on is what's happening inside of cells, including our cells, where, maybe if you've taken a biology course, you know that there's certain compartments, organelles like the nucleus and mitochondria that have membranes around them, and different things happen inside those than happen outside. But it turns out in the last couple of decades, people have realized there are all sorts of compartments that form in our cells, that don't have membranes around them, that form by something called phase separation, which is just the idea that if I take oil and water and I stir them up, they look like they're mixed, but before long, the oil forms droplets inside of the water. You've probably seen this in salad dressing, if nothing else. That kind of thing is happening inside our cells, and inside these little droplets that form, interesting biochemistry is happening. So things like metabolism, helping us process nutrients that are coming in, or signaling. Signals are coming in and coming out. And so that's been a really interesting area. I should emphasize that, again, my group is always looking for areas where physics and math and modeling can help with the understanding of the biological processes. And this is, again, an area where, because the phase separation is so physics-based, it's a great area where biology has discovered and uses physical principles, and we can learn about those from studying what biology is doing. And the last word, I'm always trying to learn new things. I like to be like a high school student, trying to learn something every day. And so my group has started to work on some problems in immunology, very much stimulated by, the recent pandemic. There's lots and lots of people are learning about how our immune systems work. And I feel like there are opportunities for folks like myself coming from a theoretical, mathematical, biophysical background to contribute to understanding that processes in the immune system.
Where do you see your field expanding to in the future? Technology is getting a lot more advanced, especially recently with AI. Do you see any of that being incorporated into your field and into future research?
Oh, absolutely. AI is having a huge impact, particularly in how people deal with large amounts of data that are coming in. So, it's kind of a great confluence of events that developing high throughput technologies where people are able to sequence the genomes, or what genes are actually being expressed and turning into proteins. Tremendous amounts of data coming from that, from humans down to bacteria. Also tremendous amounts of imaging data, being able to watch cells interacting in real time. But then the idea is, well, how does I deal with terabytes of data? We don't have millions of graduate students who can look at these and decide where the cells and what they're doing. So it's been a great advantage of having these machine learning and AI tools that can do this automatically and can then learn general statistical properties that then can be extracted and can be looked at by the scientists to say, aha, we now, by taking all this data, we see regularities that we didn't know about before. Now we can go in and design new experiments to test those, to make sure we understand what they're doing and why. So I think, AI is a field that is going to keep having an impact on science. But it's unpredictable how much that will go, what science will look like even in 10 years because of this. I'm sure there will still be scientists, though. We'll just have many more tools we can use to try to make discoveries.
Where did you start in research? Like, what was, I guess, the first lab position or exposure to research that you got?
Yeah, I mean, I had some exposure to research actually early on at Caltech, but that was basically because I had a car, and one of the faculty needed to transfer things between one university and another. So I don't think that was my best exposure to research. The first, really serious exposure to research I had was in graduate school. I think nowadays people are doing much more as undergraduates, which is great. I think there's many more. Certainly at Princeton, people are doing research certainly as juniors, and certainly everyone does a senior thesis. Some people getting into research even before that. So yeah, my first exposure to research was in graduate school. I was inspired by some work a fellow graduate student had done. I thought that there was an area that I could work on having to do, and then again, this was before I was doing biology, in what's happening when semiconductors are carrying current, and the electrons inside those semiconductors are not only being accelerated by an electric field, but they're bumping into each other. But it's a kind of good indication that it was not something that came out of my just sitting and thinking by myself. It came from talking to people, from learning what they were doing. So I feel like my career has basically been a series of good conversations that led to interesting questions that then led to projects and eventually to some kind of results and publications. So I'm very much I think a social scientist, in the sense that I believe that the social aspect of science is critical even to making progress in all of these fields.
What kind of advice would you give high schoolers? And not necessarily just technical advice, but also kind of social advice and soft skills that they can use.
Yeah, I can give you, we'll start out with the technical advice that even in this day of machine learning and AI, I think it's good to learn your math. I don't think that's going to go away. And I feel that, by taking my math courses seriously, I definitely developed intuition for how things work in the world that has guided me through my career. So I think learning, taking your math courses and trying to doing all those problems may seem a little bit boring now, but they develop some kind of mental processes that help you see how things work in the real world. And I think that's been great. But I think soft skills are also super important. And certainly one that I try to cultivate in myself is the ability to listen to other people and to ask them and not be afraid to ask naive questions. In a field, again, in biology, I didn't get my background education in biology. I find myself asking very naive questions of my biology colleagues, but as a result of not being shy about that, I make sure I get the basic understanding. And I also love to hear their views on what they think is interesting, what they think are the interesting puzzles, and what they think are the solutions. In the end, I may come up with a different answer, but I think it's super important to have good listening skills.
If you were to hire a high schooler, just theoretically, what type of traits are you looking for?
Yeah, if I was both for a high school student and for a colleague, I think I would be looking for someone who was very much interested in proving themselves, who was looking to learn, again, to learn every day and to develop new skills, someone who was ambitious about being the best scientist that they could be. All of us have our different strengths and weaknesses. We're not all going to be Einstein, that's clear, but we can become better at many different things. And I think that's important. I'm not interested in people who are trying to show off this or that, because some people will be better at some things, some will be better at another. I want people who want to be the best version of themselves. So that's definitely what I look for and would be looking for in a high school student or in any of my trainees. And I see that in my senior colleagues as well. They're always trying to improve themselves, learn new things, go in new directions. So I really admire that.
I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to do this.
Well, it was a pleasure, and I really support what you're doing. So I wish you
Thank
great
you.
success.